So next speaker is Justin Bauer, the head of product at Amplitude. And I must say this about Justin, whether he's playing flip cup or thinking about analytics strategy, he's the most passionate and brilliant, dedicated analytics minds that I have the pleasure of working with. Of course, he's also my boss, so he's kind of paying me to be very nice to him right now. Please welcome Justin Bauer.
Thank you, everyone, for attending today's Product Analytics Summit here in Seattle. Very excited to talk about the evolution of product analytics and also share some stories about how customers are using product analytics to build a better product. So Sandhya mentioned, my name is Justin Bauer, and I'm the head of product here at Amplitude. And what I'm excited today to talk about are some of the lessons we have learned from having powered over 15,000 products and having tracked over 1 trillion user actions. And those lessons are, one, how the most successful companies are building product is changing. Two, that because of that, the requirements on product teams are increasing. And then finally, three, that means that a new stack is required to meet those needs. So let's dive into each of those. So in the first one, how the most successful companies are building product is changing, what we've observed is that there are 5 key trends driving this change. The first trend is on the speed of iteration. In the past, product development moved very slowly, taking quarters to develop. But the most successful companies today have completely flipped that model on its head and now push out changes weekly, daily, or even multiple times per day. Now, what that means is because it is so much easier to build product, we've seen an explosion in the number of offerings that are out there for consumers. And because of that explosion, companies can no longer solely rely on the power of their brand or channel relationships to create value. But product is now at the centerpiece of value creation. And what that means is that we've really started to see a shift kind of in the balance of power from companies now to consumers. And we're really in this era of the customer, where you as a customer can actually demand the best experience for you, and if the product you're using doesn't deliver on that experience, then you can just move on to the next product in an almost endless line of different options. And so to be successful in today's world, companies really need to understand their user behavior and react to what users want to ultimately build the best product for them. So this leads to our second insight, which is that the requirements on product teams are now changing because of this. How many people here are familiar with Ben Horowitz, by show of hands? Great. For those of you who aren't, he's a VC in Silicon Valley and famous for being one of the early kind of thought leaders within product management. He wrote a famous post called Good Product Manager, Bad Product Manager that really kind of defined what it meant to build product at the time. And what he said was that good product teams know the market, the product line, and the competition extremely well. What we have found is that this is no longer sufficient. Yes, you need to understand those things, but to be a successful product company, you also need to know how to use data to understand your users such that you can iterate quickly to their needs. Because it's no longer sufficient just to build great product. You have to build great product fast. Which leads to our third lesson, which is that a new stack is required to start to meet these needs. So, we've talked about this ultra-competitive world, right, where product teams, marketers, growth, product managers, analysts, data scientists, engineers, all need to understand what those users are doing so they can build a better product. And yet, when we ask these teams how they're actually getting their insights, the picture looks something like this. This is not ideal. Let's walk through each of these steps to talk about what are some of the problems that this causes, right, for each of these teams. So we'll start at the data pipeline level, right? So here, what the problem is that there's only a select few people in the organization that actually even understand what is being tracked, right? And so if you're not one of those lucky people, you have to go find them. And heaven forbid you actually want to change that tracking, you're gonna have to coordinate through multiple people, multiple code pushes, right? It's a huge pain. This pain then propagates up into the query layer. where because we've built all of these different stacks, no one knows where to go to answer even the most basic questions, like how many active users do I have? Or how many of my users are completing this funnel? And so what you do is you have to find an analyst who can query that for you, which means they're taking their time answering these very basic questions. And engineers have to spend all of their time maintaining all of these systems versus actually building product, which is what they want to do. And finally, we get to the exploration layer, right? Where these iteration cycles between PMs and analysts can take days, if not weeks of time. And yes, analysts will build out dashboards to answer some of the most common questions, but dashboards are really only about consumption. They're really a one-way communication vehicle. But the moment that you want to go beyond what is a user doing, but understand why they are doing it, you have to start the iteration cycle over again, right? And so this, obviously, is a problem. And what we have found is that if your stack looks like this, you're not going to be able to keep up with the most successful companies at building product. Now, no one builds this stack, right, because they felt like it was the wrong stack to build. The reality is people build this because all these different technologies were not built or intended to actually solve this new need, right, this new need of product analytics. And so what we have seen is that the most successful companies actually deploy, right, technology that's built such that all end users can actually get insights out of their user base. And so when you do something like this, you start to see a much different picture emerge. We'll start with the PMs, growth, marketers. So now what happens there is that because they're able to ask and answer their own questions, they actually ask more questions and get to even better insights than would have been possible. Analysts and data scientists now don't have to spend their time answering all those questions for PMs, but instead can actually work on some of the higher level insights that they were brought into the company to do. And finally, engineers aren't spending their time maintaining all these complex systems, and so can actually spend their time building product, which is ultimately the goal of the entire company. So what I'd love to do next is talk through an example of how Amplitude actually uses product analytics to help us build a better product. And to do that, I'll go through a common kind of case example that we see a lot. So a lot of times we talk about this kind of problems that are going on in the industry, and we describe this analytics stack, and a lot of people come to me and say, this looks great, I definitely want to solve this problem, but then where do I start? What's the first thing that I need to do? And I typically respond to that with a question as well, which is basically saying, have you clearly defined what are the metrics that will define your success for your product organization? And so we got this question so many times, we actually put together a framework to help companies think through how to do that. So there's 3 simple steps to this framework. The first is defining your critical event. The second is using that to determine what your product's usage frequency is. And then finally using those to create your product analytics formula. So let's walk through what each of these are. What is a critical event? A critical event is an action that a user takes that reflects that they're getting value out of your product. Note, this is not app open or session started. If 40% of your users are opening your app, but only 5% of them are actually doing your critical event, you're kidding yourself if you think you have good engagement. Now, examples of this are things like playing a song, making a purchase, creating a playlist, completing a game, right? These things aren't necessarily rocket science, and yet we find that most app developers aren't measuring themselves in this fashion. Now, once you've defined your critical event, you can use that to determine what your product's usage frequency is. Now, once again, many of you probably have pretty good intuition as to what your usage frequency is, how often you expect a user to use your product. And yet, we see time and time again companies using the wrong metrics to measure themselves. How many people here are familiar with the concept of end-day retention, by show of hands? A couple of people, okay. For those of you who aren't, end-day retention measures the percentage of new users who come back specifically on the nth day. So what percentage of new users come back exactly 4 days later, exactly 14, or exactly 24 days later? Now, if you have a daily usage frequency product, let's say like the game that we have up here at the top, then measuring yourself in that fashion makes sense, right? A lot of empirical evidence suggests that if a user doesn't return within 24 hours, they likely are not going to come back, right? So end-day retention is a really important metric for you. But if you're that on-demand grocery delivery service there at the bottom, why do you care what percentage of your users come back exactly 4 days later? You don't. That doesn't reflect your expected usage frequency. And yet, when we talk to companies that have these types of usage frequencies, they're still using end-day retention to measure their retention, right? Now, like I said before, you probably have pretty good intuition as to what your usage frequency is. But if you don't, we've put together a simple heuristic that you can use to define that. And so what you can do is actually plot out how long it takes your users to repeat your critical event. So we've got 3 actual examples here from customers of ours. We've got a music delivery service that's in red. And for them, we found that their users repeat their critical event, most of them within the first day. In fact, 80% of them are repeating that multiple sessions within their first day. So that is clearly a daily usage frequency type of product. But then we look at that food delivery service, and we see for their users, it actually takes almost 3 weeks for 80% of their users to repeat that critical event. And so that usage frequency is probably more like a bi-weekly or maybe even a monthly usage frequency, and therefore they should measure their metrics based on that. Now, once you've defined your critical event and your usage frequency, you can use that to create what we call your product analytics formula. So this is an actual example of our formula at Amplitude. And the value of creating your product analytics formula is now you can start to outline what are the drivers of success for your product. As Spencer mentioned, right, overall metric is number of queries run. That's our engagement metric. And then we've broken that down into the 3 components that actually make that up, which is 1, breadth, right, the number of users we have. 2, depth, how many queries those users are actually doing. And then finally, we look at frequency, how often they come into the product per week. And if we actually outline all of those, the benefit of this is we can now start to improve each of these metrics, and you actually even align your teams against that, and ultimately drive engagement up. So what I'd love to do next is walk through some examples of how you can both measure and improve yourselves against each of these different components. So we'll start with breadth. As I mentioned, breadth is basically a measure of your usage. So for us, we're a weekly usage frequency, and so we look at weekly active queryers. But we don't stop there. We actually break that metric down into what stage our users are in their product lifecycle, right? And so we've got 3 stages outlined here. We have new users. Those are users who are new to the product that week. We have current users, which means users who used the product the previous week and also this week. And then finally, resurrected users, users who did not use the product in the previous week but came back and used it this week. Now, the value of doing this is you can now start to understand what are the drivers of your growth, right? For a product like Amplitude that is growing really quickly, you're going to see that a lot of your new users are making up your weekly active queryers, and so you're going to really want to focus in on new users. But if you have maybe a more mature product, you might actually find that resurrected users are driving a significant portion of your active user base, and so you should focus on what their experience is. Now, this is how you measure what is happening. If you want to then figure out how to improve it, the right metrics to use is actually see how users convert from each of those stages of the life cycle. So for example here, we basically have tracking what percentage of users convert to become current users, right? We can see what percentage of new users become current, what percentage of our current users come back again the next week, as well as resurrected users. So depending on what's a really important metric for you and what makes up your weekly active users, you might drive one of these metrics over the other. Now that's on the breadth side. On the depth side, what we do is we actually track how many queries someone runs per week. So that's pretty basic. And we actually use a rolling average for this because there's quite a bit of volatility in that metric. So we use a 7-day rolling average to track that. So that's a metric that's really important for us. And then to understand how to improve that, we actually look at our new user cohorts and see how they change over time. Once again, new users is an important component of Amplitude's growth. And so we actually want to see users actually run more and more queries over time. So what we've done is broken those down into kind of 4 different cohorts. So we have users who are new the week of January 24th, January 30th, February 6th, and onward. And this is a hypothetical example, but basically what we're looking to see is that how many of those users, how many queries do they run on their first day, second day, third day? And we want to see those curves go up, as you can see in the example. Because if we know that if users are running more queries early, given how much of our users are new, they're more likely to then convert into current users. So this is a really important metric for us to measure. And finally, to measure frequency, we look at a statistic we call stickiness, which is basically looking at what percentage of your users use your application 2 days, 3 days, 4 days, et cetera, within a given week. And from here, we can actually see that for this example, for instance, we average a stickiness of around 2.7 days. And so then to improve that, we might actually look at our day 3 and day 5 stickiness over time or by release to see if we're driving that metric up, right? With the goal of getting those over 50% or whatever the frequency is that you're trying to drive within your quarter or whatever, however you set your goals. Great. So in conclusion, if you're looking to set your product's kind of KPIs, what we recommend doing is 1, defining your critical event, 2, using that to determine your product's usage frequency, and then 3, using that to create your product analytics formula, where you outline the drivers of those events and align your teams against improving those. Now, if you're interested in learning more about this, we actually put out a product analytics playbook which talks about this stuff. In fact, if you haven't grabbed your copy, definitely recommend going outside. We've got a table right over there. It's got over 150 pages of examples of how you can build a better product through improving your attention. It talks about frameworks like these, as well as lots of others that we developed working with our own customers, as well as other thought leaders in the space. It's a really great material, and I definitely recommend that you check it out. And with that, I'll open it up for questions.
Hi, thanks for great presentation. So for the large companies, one of the challenges of using a third-party analytical tool is there are a lot of data that is distributed across various places. So let me give you an example. I worked for Home Depot before, and Sears. So one of the critical components at Sears was loyalty data, and which was mainly from store interactions. And this similar situation was with Home Depot as well. And most of the data that was being tracked so far was the online data. But because the store data and the usage was very, very critical to building the experiences, it is a truly multi-channel company, the challenge of onboarding any vendor to utilize that data set was very cumbersome. So what we did is we just hired analysts and we started pulling the data on our own and started doing the analysis to make the product decisions. How do you overcome challenges when the company is so large and there's so much critical data sitting around all over?
Yeah, that's People hear me? Oh, great, thank you. Yes, that is a great question. I'm actually going to go back to that product analytics stack slide because I think it actually talks a little bit about that. So there's a couple components to that. One is that when we talk about product analytics, that doesn't necessarily mean that we're replacing what we call the data warehouse stack, right? Like that's always going to exist. There's always going to be additional data that you want to track, right? That isn't necessarily online data that you're going to need to merge in. But what's really important is those lines those arrows that are touching each other, the ability to get that data into your product analytics stack. So it's a really important component of how we built out Amplitude, is that you can actually send offline data into Amplitude using our HTTP API. And so if that's a really important component of your usage, right, then we recommend actually sending that data in and then being able to merge that with users. Now, for a lot of companies, they haven't even figured out how to understand what users are doing literally in their applications. And so I would definitely recommend starting there first before trying to take on this massive kind of merging of all of your different user sets. But we do have examples of companies that are actually sending in data that isn't being tracked necessarily like from the client, right, from the actual application, and marrying that within Amplitude.
Hi, so I have a follow-up question to that answer, which was, we heard Spencer say that for product analytics, you really don't need personally identifiable information to be sent to Amplitude. It seems to me like in that particular example you're giving, you do, because you need a way to tie the fact that I'm, Stu Kim Brown, Home Depot user at the Concord Home Depot, and Stu Kim Brown, the guy who's purchased something online. with my email address or some other phone number or something. So is there a happy medium there, or what? Is there a way, I guess, for us to get around that sharing of the personally identifiable information?
Yeah, so what we'll find is that companies that are very diligent on PII, they can actually hash, and so they can use that, so that we're, as Amplitude, never seeing that. Right now, obviously, you can maintain that on your end, but you can actually send those hashes both through what's being tracked on the client as well as being tracked within store.
How do you cross-reference the usage with like crash reports, bugs, defects, so that you can track user behavior?
Yeah, great question. So depending on what you're using for crash reporting, if you're using criticism, we actually do that out of the box, so we have an integration with them. If you're not, if you're kind of measuring that yourself, once again, it comes down to having some identifier that you can use to send that data within Amplitude. So it could be a user ID, if you track user IDs. We have kind of a set of canonical IDs, so user ID is at the top. If we don't have user ID, we'll use a device ID. Right, so let's say you have two SDKs, you can actually communicate between the SDKs, and we can track and pull that user ID, and then you can send that to Amplitude, or whatever other kind of way that you might be able to merge those users. So if there's a separate user property, for instance, we have examples of companies that have used that as well.
Another quick question. So defining your core metric, right? And I mean, that assumes that you know certain things and that you can pick, you know what you know. The challenge always is what you don't know. So another powerful thing, and a lot of what you guys were talking about at the beginning, which was the application actually coming to some conclusions for you to let you know what you didn't know your users were doing that was actually driving retention. So you may, as usual, as a product manager knows, you're always wrong. So when you define that first metric, you're already wrong. You're just trying to get close enough that you're not so wrong that you can't grow the app, right? But very useful to actually get some feedback. So how do you balance between what you think you know and what you don't know?
Great question. So one thing related to that, I think there's two things. So one is the product analytics playbook actually goes through tons of examples that are like the Calm example, where it's like, actually, how do you understand what users are doing in their first session, their first week? It goes through examples of how to create behavioral personas to see like what sets of users are doing what actions. So a lot of great ways that your data can kind of suggest what you don't know and kind of explore that. So I would advise checking out the playbook for that. But I think another part of your question is also what we kind of see, which is this like potential analysis paralysis, right? So it is really important that, yes, you're going to know more tomorrow than you know today, and that's going to be true forever. That doesn't mean you shouldn't set what your core KPI is today. Right? And so queries run, right, is our core KPI. Will that be our KPI forever? Probably not. We're probably going to advance the product. We're going to learn about new use cases, right? And that will advance with it. But what's really important is that you don't let perfect be the enemy of good, right? So you still want to set what you believe your metric is right now, and then use a product like Amplitude to then figure out over time, is that actually driving your overall goals? Are you making more money, for instance? I mean, that was a big portion of why we chose queries run. It's because we know that correlates really well with upsells, right? And so that's a great metric for us. But you actually use your product analytics tool to figure that out. And so it will evolve over time, but I don't like it when companies are like, well, let's just not have a metric right now because we're trying to figure out, choose something, right, and then evolve it over time.
Hi, I'm Chris from Microsoft. So just riffing off of what you just said, right? You know certain things, and you can sort of set those metrics. And I think Amplitude has this feature, I think it's called segments, right? Where you can sort of provide some cues to the system, and then it goes and discovers if those are outliers or not. Am I giving it the right name?
It might be Compass. Is it about looking at correlations that exist within your data set?
You can say like, hey, how do users who perform this action, measure against this metric, right? So, so when you do that, you're providing sort of a cue or a guide to your platform, saying, hey, go tell me how this segment or group of users behaves for this metric, right? And but what if you didn't know what sort of cue to give? Have you sort of thought about maybe just discovering clusters or groups of users who are outliers for a given metric?
Yes, definitely. So one of the features that we have in Amplitude is actually what we call personas, which is a clustering algorithm, which will do that. And we actually talk a lot about that within the playbook, which is understanding basically what different types of personas or user kind of actions are occurring within your product. We actually used it internally to drive a lot of what we did in releasing the new version of our product, which was Amplitude 2.0. So I actually discovered that a lot of our users had our user base had shifted from mostly just people who were kind of querying to people who are now also doing consumption as well as querying. And that drove a big reason why we had a major uplift or change within the dashboarding components of Amplitude. In addition, we actually had major changes in another feature of ours, which is called user timeline, because we discovered that a significant portion of our users actually looked more like kind of customer support versus just traditionally product managers, which we wouldn't have necessarily known if the algorithm hadn't actually discovered that there was a set of users who only used user timeline and didn't use the other features of the product. We felt that was an important component of our product experience, and so we decided to move that up the roadmap and actually improve that experience.
Hi, I'm Brent with Tableau. And I get the product analytics stack, I get the marketing interchange, the data warehouse, all that stuff. But what I'm wondering is what does the Amplitude system offer that basically ends up nurturing the conversation based off of the data that's coming out with the actual end customer, right? Is there capabilities, are there things that basically turn it into a sales conversation through Salesforce with the sales account? Are there things that basically turn it into the survey or the right sort of personalized prompts to the user so you can actually refine more and ask more questions when you detect the event? Could you explain maybe some examples of that?
Yeah, exactly. I think it's a great question. So it does come back to something that Spencer had mentioned earlier as well, which is that we are very much focused on the product analytics portion of the problem. And so the way that I would kind of frame us is we're helping you understand what are the drivers of that, but we may not necessarily be the tool you would use to actually action on that insight. You would then potentially use your marketing stack tool, right, or use your sales stack tool to action. But if you want to understand what users are doing, right, and understand why they're doing it such that then you might have this certain drip campaign, right, or you may do some other action, right, you can understand that, uncover it in Amplitude, and then use the users you identify in Amplitude, send that to another tool where you then engage with those customers.
Last time I saw the Compass product, it was to define the aha moment. Is that right?
To some extent, yes. We're trying to uncover what, in fact, the calm example is an example of something that was uncovered through Compass.
So would that aha moment be the same as this critical event, or would it be correlated in some way?
Great question. So they're not necessarily the same. They could be. The example I give is the most famous aha moment, which is Facebook's. Adding 7 friends in their first 10 days. So that, if you're not familiar with it, that's kind of the common, like, okay, once a user added 7 friends, that means they had their network, that was enough for them to get going. But adding 7 friends is not the critical event, right? No one goes to Facebook to add friends, right? It is an important part of the first-time user experience because it correlates really well with eventually you engaging in the product. But the critical event for Facebook is something different, right? It may be engaging within the feed. I'm not exactly sure what it is for them, but it's definitely not adding friends. But clearly, and we talk about it in the product analytics playbook, you don't want to necessarily drive users to using all of your power features in your first day, right? And so you need to think about what's the experience they need to have in their first session, which leads them to their second session. And so with the Facebook example, that was adding friends. Because if you didn't have friends, you never could even get to the critical event.
Hi, I'm Gui from Microsoft. So one of the challenges we have in working with Amplitude is we have a large part of our data that we want to join and map to user events, be part of like this data warehouse stack, right? And once the user event has been sent to Amplitude, you can only map it with the things that's already been uploaded, right? You know what I'm talking about, right? So is there any plans to enable sort of like the ability to backfill or run them backwards?
Yes, definitely. In fact, we should chat afterwards. There's a lot of things on our roadmap that are being addressed towards those types of use cases. And so, yeah, let's definitely chat afterwards. I'd love to dive a bit more into the use case. But yes, we're definitely looking into that. Thank you, everyone.